A dictator's greatest nightmare is neither the threat of war nor a crisis environment. The real fear is always the awakening of the people they rule. Vladimir Putin faced this nightmare in 2022 as the people's silence was broken. When tens of thousands of brave people took to the streets to protest the war, the regime thought it had brutally suppressed this fire of rebellion. It thought it had rebuilt its wall of fear, but it was wrong. That fire has now reignited in a much more dangerous, much more symbolic, and much more contagious way on the icy streets of Putin's own hometown, St. Petersburg. And the music of this flame was the very same ominous melody that brought down the Soviet Union. On the night of October 15th, 2025, hundreds of Russian youths in St. Petersburg gathered fearlessly and sang the Swan Lake ballet. This was no simple melody. It was the famous melody from Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake ballet, which the regime officially banned in 2023, and which became the unofficial anthem of an empire's collapse. Russian youth are now in unison on the streets of St. Petersburg, like a pledge of rebellion. This was not just a song, it was the reawakening of the ghost of 1991 in Putin's mind, that great collapse trauma. Not every protest that erupts in Russia is equal. Where the spark of an uprising is ignited is even more important than the uprising itself. An angry mob storming a military recruitment office in a mountain village in Dagestan is a regional problem that the Kremlin can manage, isolate, and if necessary, brutally suppress. But when the spectre of that uprising appears on St. Petersburg's historic Nevsky Prospect or Moscow's Tverskaya Street, it is no longer a problem, but an existential threat to the regime. Without understanding the ominous and historical significance of the Swan Lake protests, beginning in St. Petersburg, rather than in Samara or Kursk, we cannot comprehend the great fear that robs Putin of his sleep. Because these two cities are not just capitals, they are the soul, brain, and heart of the Russian state. And when these organs fail, the entire body dies. A protest that begins in St. Petersburg is not just any protest, it is the whisper of history. This city is coded in Russian memory as the Cradle of Revolution, the bloody rehearsal of 1905, and, most importantly, the Great October Revolution of 1917, which overthrew the Tsarist regime and changed the world, began in the streets of this city, in front of its palaces. That symbolic raid on the Winter Palace, that cannon shot fired from the cruiser Aurora, all of it is etched into this city's DNA. That is why, when an anti-regime slogan is shouted in St. Petersburg, it is not just the anger of a citizen, but the ghost of 1917 reawakening. This triggers the greatest fear lurking in the subconscious of every leader in the Kremlin: the repetition of history. Whenever the streets of St. Petersburg stir, those in power in the Kremlin cannot help but look out their windows and ask, will our end be like that of the Tsar? This is a psychological and historical weapon that the city carries. Secondly, St. Petersburg is Russia's window to Europe. It was founded by Peter precisely for this purpose, to integrate Russia with the West. For centuries, it has been Russia's most liberal, most intellectual, most artistic, and most Western city. Therefore, a rising rebellion in this city is not just a rebellion against Putin, but also against everything he represents. Isolationism, anti-Western sentiment, and the repressive and anti-democratic ideology of Eurasianism. This is the rebellion of Russia's European spirit against Asian despotism. This is the rejection of Putin's narrative of Russian civilization in the very city where that civilization was born. That is why its symbolic significance is enormous. And finally, the most personal blow. St. Petersburg is Vladimir Putin's hometown. It is where his political career began, where he rose from the KGB to deputy mayor, where he laid the foundations for his current power. It is his castle. It is his backyard. Losing control in this city is a much greater personal and political defeat than losing in Smolensk or Volgograd. It means being rejected in his own home, by his own neighbors. It is the most painful proof that he is no longer safe even in his most trusted stronghold, that the foundations of his power are rotten. And that night, Putin was seen by 140 million Russians as a leader who couldn't silence Swan Lake in his own city. So how did such a daring act of civil disobedience manage to take place at the heart of the regime's most ruthless apparatus of repression? The anatomy of this incident actually reveals how fragile the ground is on which Putin's regime stands, and how the anger that has built up over the last 2 years is ready to explode in a new and much more dangerous form. This is not just a momentary outburst, it is a calculated challenge, a perfect storm of economic collapse and symbolic resistance. Above all, the event itself, the public use of the Swan Lake melody, is the most daring, most organized act of civil disobedience since the 2022 anti-war mass arrests and the brutal crackdown that followed. In 2022, tens of thousands of people took to the streets in a more individual and spontaneous manner, carrying "No to War" banners. Today's action, however, possesses a much deeper historical consciousness and symbolic power. The protesters are targeting not only the war, but the regime itself, the collapse it has created, and its frightening similarity to the final days of the Soviet Union. This is not just a reaction, it is a diagnosis. Your regime is collapsing just like the Soviet Union, and we are playing the music of that collapse, they say. To understand how much the regime fears this symbol, one need only turn back the clock 1 year. In 2023, the Kremlin quietly enacted a ban classifying the unauthorized playing and performance of the ballet Swan Lake in public spaces as extremist activity. This was the clearest proof of how much Putin and his ideologues feared the ominous, destructive power of this melody in the Russian collective memory. A regime that fears a ballet actually fears its own end, its own history. And now that greatest fear is manifesting itself in the very heart of St. Petersburg, despite the bans. This was a declaration that the regime no longer had the power to control not only the streets but also people's memories and symbols. However, what really fueled this fire of rebellion, making it much more dangerous and with the potential to spread to much wider audiences than the 2022 protests, was the economic trigger. The 2022 protests were largely based on moral and political grounds. The participants were mostly the educated middle class in large cities who opposed the moral wrongness of the war and Russia's international isolation. Today's protests, however, are fueled not only by political anger, but also by a concrete and harsh economic reality that is hurting millions of people, preventing them from putting food on the table. The Kremlin's 22% new value-added tax, introduced to finance the war machine, and which eroded the purchasing power of the people overnight. Empty supermarket shelves due to factories halting production because of the war economy. And most importantly, that relentless, unstoppable inflation hitting everything from basic foodstuffs to rent, while wages remain stagnant. This toxic cocktail is now turning even the millions who remained silent in 2022, who said, "Politics isn't my business," into part of the street. Because this is no longer a matter of political preference, but a struggle for survival. To understand why Swan Lake has become an anthem of rebellion for young people in Russia, one must look at the ominous, dark meaning of this melody engraved in the Russian collective memory. This is not just ballet music, it is the soundtrack of political disaster, uncertainty, and most importantly, the collapse of an empire for a generation. The curse of this melody began in the early 1980s and reached its peak in the Great Rupture of 1991. It all began during that dark period when Soviet leaders died one after another. When Leonid Brezhnev died in 1982, Yuri Andropov in 1984, and Konstantin Chernenko in 1985. During those moments of uncertainty while the Kremlin agreed on a new leader, state television would interrupt its normal programming and broadcast one thing for hours, sometimes days: a recording of the Swan Lake Ballet. When people saw those graceful swans on their television screens, they understood that something was collapsing behind the Kremlin walls, that an era was coming to an end. The melody had become a symbol of the political crisis. But the real curse of Swan Lake was that it changed Russia's destiny forever during those 3 days in August 1991, when the radical wing of the Communist Party attempted a coup against Mikhail Gorbachev. When the coup plotters seized power, state television did the same thing again. It cut normal programming and broadcast Swan Lake non-stop for 3 days. For those 3 days, millions of Soviet citizens watched those swans spinning around on their television screens, not knowing whether their country was on the brink of civil war, who the tanks would crush, or what the future would bring. When the coup failed and the collapse of the Soviet Union accelerated, Swan Lake became an irreversible trauma soundtrack, symbolizing not just the death of a leader, but the death of a system, an empire. This is precisely Putin's greatest fear, the revival of that trauma. In February 2022, when the invasion of Ukraine began, tens of thousands of people across Russia, from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok, took to the streets shouting, "No to war!" The regime saw this potential for rebellion and was terrified. At that time, the most intense protests took place in Moscow and St. Petersburg. If St. Petersburg is the soul of Russia, Moscow is its brain, its heart, its central nervous system. A protest in Moscow is not an injury anywhere on the body, but a direct brain hemorrhage. Because Moscow is not just a capital city, it is the absolute center of gravity of the Russian state. The Kremlin is there, the Ministry of Defense is there, the FSB headquarters, Lubyanka, is there. The headquarters of all state television stations, all propaganda apparatus are there. Therefore, tens of thousands of people pouring into the streets in Moscow is not a protest against the regime, but a rebellion within the regime's own castle. This means that the enemy has breached the gates and entered the palace courtyard. The most critical consequence of this situation is its impact on the elites who form the backbone of the regime, namely the nomenklatura and the siloviki, security bureaucracy. An uprising in Dagestan or Kursk is a distant problem watched on television for a general, a minister, or an oligarch in Moscow. It does not directly affect their luxurious lifestyles, their villas in Rubliovka, or their children's education in London. In fact, such regional crises may even suit them, as they increase the power and importance of the center. But when those protests, that chaos, happen in Pushkin Square just a few blocks from their own homes, the equation changes completely. This is the moment when the threat becomes concrete, no longer abstract. This is the moment when the regime begins to fear that it cannot even protect itself. This is the moment that causes them to question their loyalty to the regime, to think, is the ship sinking? Who should jump first? An uprising in Samara is a regional police matter. An uprising in Moscow, however, is an existential crisis that forces every elite to make a decision about their own future, their own wealth, and their own safety. As documented by The Guardian, the Putin regime brutally suppressed these protests by arresting tens of thousands of people, enacting new and ruthless censorship laws, and completely controlling the media. This was the moment when the regime's fear of civil disobedience and panic over losing control reached its peak. He thought he had buried the ghost of that uprising in an iron fist. But today, that spirit, violently suppressed in 2022, has merged with the ominous symbol of 1991 and re-emerged like a nightmare at the regime's weakest, most vulnerable moment. Why does this new wave of rebellion rising in the streets of St. Petersburg carry a much more dangerous, much more destructive potential than the protests of 2022? Because this time, it is not just political and moral anger that stands against the regime. This time, there is a much more primitive and much more powerful dynamic that fundamentally shakes the regime's most basic source of legitimacy, namely its promise of economic stability. Empty wallets and the fear of hunger. This is a toxic cocktail that the regime cannot control or suppress. The 2022 protests remained largely within a moral and political framework. Protesters were against the wrongness of the war, Russia's transformation into an international pariah state, and Putin's imperial ambitions. However, at that time, the economic effects of the war had not yet fully hit people's pockets. The Kremlin's propaganda machine was still managing to pump out the lie that Western sanctions don't bother us. And so, the protests were largely confined to the educated middle class in the big cities. Factory workers and rural farmers, the regime's silent majority, did not participate in these protests to any great extent. Now, however, the equation has completely changed. 3.5 years of war have eaten away at the Russian economy like cancer, and the metastases of this cancer have now reached every home, every kitchen. The anger of the young people shouting "Swan Lake" in the streets of St. Petersburg today is fueled not only by the pain of their peers dying in Ukraine, but also by their mothers' helplessness in front of empty supermarket shelves, their fathers' cut salaries, and their own lack of future. This is the most dangerous moment, when moral anger and economic helplessness converge. This is the moment when the regime's greatest wall of propaganda, the wall of patriotism and stability, is shattered by the harsh economic realities. Even people who remain silent about the news of tens of thousands of casualties in Ukraine will not hesitate to take to the streets when their own wallets are empty and their own children face the threat of going hungry. This has been the fundamental rule of all revolutions throughout history, and Putin, by forgetting this rule, is preparing his own demise. Faced with this new and dangerous wave of rebellion, the Putin regime's response reveals just how much panic and helplessness it is in. The Kremlin's feeble and clumsy attempts to prevent the protests from spreading are not a show of strength, but a reflection of its fear of completely losing control, of a repeat of the collapse scenario of 1991. The regime's first reflex, as always, was to attack technology. As images of the protests began to spread, internet speeds were deliberately slowed down in major cities such as St. Petersburg and Moscow, and access to encrypted messaging applications on social messaging and sharing platforms was restricted. This is not a show of strength, but rather a painful admission that the regime was unable to prevent the 2022 protests from being organized and spread in the digital sphere. Putin and his KGB-trained advisors remember very well that one of the key factors in the failure of the 1991 coup against Gorbachev was the newly emerging independent media and flow of information at the time. They have not forgotten how that flow of information debunked the regime's lies and mobilized the people. Now, in the 21st century, knowing that this flow of information is millions of times faster and more uncontrollable, they are horrified. Moves such as shutting down the internet and banning messaging apps are as futile and feeble an effort as trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. This is proof that the regime has now lost not only the streets, but also the digital square. And the greatest irony in the anatomy of this crisis is history's revenge. Throughout his more than 20 years in power, Vladimir Putin has built his greatest political project on a single idea: to reverse the geopolitical catastrophe created by the collapse of the Soviet Union, to make Russia a great and respected empire once again. But today, with every step he takes, every decision he makes, he is dragging his country back into the very dynamics of the 1991 collapse he despises, into the conditions of that chaos, with his own hands. Just as in the late 1980s, the country is militarily bankrupt, bogged down in a quagmire war, Afghanistan versus Ukraine. Just as in that period, the civilian economy is collapsing due to the war economy, market shelves are emptying, and the people are becoming impoverished. And just as in that period, a people who no longer believe the regime's lies and who want change are beginning to take to the streets with symbolic actions. While Putin tries to resurrect the ghost of the Soviet Union, he is actually digging up its corpse from the grave and covering his own regime with it. History is taking its revenge in a ruthless way, and Putin is becoming the architect of his own worst fear. These flames on the home front are putting Vladimir Putin in a complete checkmate position militarily, politically, and strategically. This is a strategic trap created by the war he started, where every move results in a loss, and there is no winning scenario. Putin is now stuck in an inevitable two-front war. The first front is the muddy trenches of Ukraine. There, his army is losing blood, losing ground, and losing morale every day. Any hope of military victory is long gone. The only goal now is to prevent total collapse and hold out as long as possible. But now, behind Putin, a second front has opened up that is at least as dangerous, if not more destructive, than the Ukrainian front. Russia's own cities, its own streets. While bogged down in a military quagmire in Ukraine, it now faces an uprising within its own borders that its people cannot suppress. The regime has neither the military, nor the police, nor the economic power to fight on both fronts at the same time. Every new soldier sent to Ukraine is actually a police officer missing from the streets of St. Petersburg. Every new $1 billion spent on the war is actually social aid that cannot be used to appease the people's anger. The regime is losing on both fronts. The most dangerous aspect of this situation is the potential for a domino effect. Today in St. Petersburg, this symbolic action started by a few hundred brave young people could spread tomorrow to Moscow, Yekaterinburg, Novosibirsk. In the industrial Monogorods, the single factory cities hardest hit by the economic crisis, where factories have closed, this spark could turn into a forest fire. People may have been afraid in 2022, but today, hunger accompanies that fear. And where there is hunger, walls of fear are easier to tear down. This symbolic action that began in St. Petersburg could trigger a domino effect that will lead to the regime completely losing control, pouring hundreds of thousands, even millions of people into the streets. This is the beginning of the end for the regime. This is the Kremlin's worst nightmare. Ultimately, Vladimir Putin thought that in 2022, by imprisoning tens of thousands of people, he had silenced the voice of his people's rebellion and buried that ghost. But today, Tchaikovsky's immortal notes, the ominous melody of Swan Lake, echo through the Kremlin's walls like a vow of revenge, like a mutiny call. Thank you for choosing us.